This is the Jefferson Memorial, a souvenir of the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. Built with profits from the fair, it stands as a permanent gateway to our happiest civic memory. A reminder of that fabulous summer when the world got off at Union Station and beat a path to Forest Park. A time when down Lindell Boulevard, gay parades escorted presidents and Oriental princes to view the wonders of civilization assembled in St. Louis. When, just across the street, in the shadow of a plaster mountain, prosperous gentlemen dined their ladies to the sound of an Austrian yodel. And to the west, from de Bolivar along the fabled Pike, St. Louis built a circus world where Eskimos and camel drivers, bearded Turks and Irish dancers competed for attention. And at Washington University, the crown jewels of England were on display. It was a summer when Forest Park was transformed into a setting fit for a Roman god. When enormous white palaces rose line on line, and below Art Hill, waterfalls and colored fountains danced to the sound of Sousa's band. I'm Shelby Stork. In the next hour, you're going to see the fair as it was in that fabulous summer of 1904. You're going to see it through the eyes of the many photographers whose work has been assembled here by the Missouri Historical Society. Some 36,000 photographs. And you'll be witness to an actual historical event, because for the first time anywhere on television, you'll see actual motion pictures of the St. Louis World's Fair. These are films which have been virtually lost in the vaults of the Library of Congress, but which have been restored and will be seen now for the first time in over 50 years. The fair itself began in 1898 with an idea by Pierre Chouteau, who suggested that it was time for St. Louis to honor Thomas Jefferson and the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. Well, the statue here is the result of that intention. And the World's Fair was, in fact, named the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. But although Jefferson's remarkable bargain was the official excuse, the St. Louis World's Fair quickly became a historic event in its own right. As a matter of fact, its cost was some $2 million more than that of the Louisiana Purchase it was intended to celebrate. But more important than the cost was the fact that such a worldwide observance should be held here in St. Louis, that the idea for holding it would generate here in St. Louis. Because at the turn of the century, St. Louis did not seem a likely location for a worldwide observance of this kind. St. Louis was somewhere between a great city and a big country town. We had more paved streets and more trolley cars than any city in America. But there was no art museum. The city water was full of mud, and city politics matched the water supply. True, St. Louis was prosperous. We were the central marketplace for half the Midwest. The essentials of life were cheap. A shave was a nickel. A bath in a porcelain tub was 15 cents. And a poor man could buy his liquor at 5 cents a paralyzing glass. The people who lived here liked it. But to a skeptical Easterner, St. Louis's major claim to fame was caskets, shoes, and beer. Many of our now famous industries were still sickly youngsters. The Monsanto Chemical Company, for example, was nearly broke. But we did have prosperous newspapers. The Post-Dispatch, the Globe Democrat, the Star Chronicle, and the famous Westlicher Post. Most of our streets were lighted by gas. Vandeventer Place was still a good address, but fashionable people were building farther west in a new subdivision called Portland Place. St. Louis in 1900 was a leisurely Midwestern city undisturbed by vulgar, large ambitions. But in these pleasant homes, there were men determined to make it something else, to make it, for one summer at least, the center of the civilized world. One of these men was David Roland Francis. formerly mayor of St. Louis and governor of the state. Now, Francis was elected chairman of the Fair Committee in 1899. He was, by all accounts, a remarkable gentleman. It was under his leadership that the committee raised $5 million by popular subscription. The city of St. Louis added another $5 million to that. And in March of 1901, Congress came through with a matching sum. In August of 1901, the financial barriers were down. And it was then that President McKinley issued an official proclamation inviting all of the nations of the world to come and celebrate in St. Louis. And while the invitations were going out, construction of the fair began. The chosen site was the entire western end of Forest Park, from Oakland on the south to Big Bend Boulevard on the west, and as far north as the Rock Island right-of-way, an area of more than 1,250 acres. At the time, the land was known as the Wilderness. About the only human occupants were the ladies from the Audubon Society. Naturally, they objected to its destruction. But on December 28, 1901, Director of Works Isaac Taylor and Chief of Design Monsieur Emmanuel Mascaret appeared to have no regrets when President Francis signed the contracts that would turn this natural forest into the barren landscape of progress. It would be a big job, but in all respects, Mr. Taylor seemed big enough to handle it. In late December of 1901, the ground was officially broken, and workmen from the Morris Rich Construction Company started moving the park.
It was 10 below zero the day I started work out at the fair. The trees were down, and there was about 3,000 of us against more stumps than you could count. Forest Park looked like Monday morning on the moon. The ground was frozen to a depth of a half a foot, and a pick would bounce like a rubber ball when you struck it. Sure, we finally had to dynamite a hole to put the dynamite in. We froze most of the winter, and when spring came, me and the 8-horse plow almost disappeared entirely in the mud. But they was paying 35 cents an hour, and in 1904, a man would have to be foolish indeed to quit a job like that. Our biggest trouble was straightening out the River de Pere. She was a crooked little stream that wandered all over the park like a dog smelling trees. Naturally, that was an affront to the architects who liked their rivers neat and tidy. So we filled in some of it, and we put the rest in a wooden box about 4,600 feet long. We were supposed to have to finish the job in 65 days. And in spite of the bad weather and the bad whiskey and other natural obstacles, we got it done.
By early summer of 1902, the ground was clear, and some of the buildings were on their way up. And all that summer, on Sundays after church, people would pack a lunch and come out to see how the fair was doing.
In June, I got a job with the Roan Tree Construction Company that was engaged in putting up a building called the Palace of Varied Industries. Mr. Kinsey said there'd be 12 such palaces at the fair, and that put St. Louis about 10 up on the King of England so far as palaces were concerned. But of course they weren't built to last. There was a framework of yellow leaf pine, and over that we put a mixture of plaster and burlap called staff. The columns and the heavy ornaments were made out of plaster of Paris, and in that one building we used over 4,000 tons of it and about 7 million feet of lumber. Before the plaster went on, we nailed a layer of roofing paper over the frame so that it wouldn't leak, which, as I understood, it was one of the main difficulties with having a palace. At the same time that we were putting up the buildings, there was a whole gang of other fellas turning out the statues. They were all made of plaster, of that I'm sure. But just what they were all about, I never did discover. In the spring of 1903, There was still a year to go before the fair was supposed to open. But some of the palaces were finished, and to keep up the public interest, they had a celebration to dedicate the fair. We got off work for the day, and there was supposed to be a big crowd. But it turned cold, and there weren't many out to cheer. Naturally, a little bad weather didn't discourage the politicians, and there were enough governors and diplomats to fill the Union Station. But the big attraction was the three presidents. The ex-President Grover Cleveland, President Roosevelt, and of course our own President Francis. And the next day, we went back to work.
Exactly 1 year later, the fair was ready to open. This is the area where the zoo is now. From this area, it spread for 2 miles to the west. It included the zoo, the boathouse and lake, and the art museum, which was built for the fair. All in all, more than 1,500 separate buildings had been put up, including those of 34 different foreign nations. Both the present golf courses were included in the grounds, plus all of the Washington University campus and all of the land south of Clayton Road as far west as Big Bend. It was and still is the largest fair ever built. Now, April 30th, 1904 was scheduled to be opening day. And you can imagine the excitement that ran through St. Louis as that day approached. For nearly 3 years, thousands of men had been building a fantastic city in the middle of the park. For months, the newspapers had been full of nothing but the fair. The Post-Dispatch ran a prize contest for the best poem on the subject. In the schools, thousands of school children were doing handwriting samples for the education building. And downtown businessmen were speculating about what it might do for the future of the city. While down in their basements, local inventors were building everything from a dirigible to a mechanical man in the hopes of winning a prize. The city was literally consumed with curiosity. And then the waiting was over. And throughout the city, the state, and the nation, the billboards blossomed with the news. On April 30th, 1904, the World's Fair would open.
As I recall, the function began with a ceremonial parade from Brookings Hall to the Louisiana Monument. Naturally, everyone who was of any importance was present. There were ambassadors from more than 30 foreign nations, governors and senators from nearly every state in the Union, and of course all the prominent men and women of St. Louis. According to reports, there were also 187,793 others in attendance, including Prince Pu Lun of China. The principal speaker was William Howard Taft, but first the invocation was given by the Reverend Gonzales of Chicago. Then President Francis gave the opening address. "Open ye gates," he said. "Swing wide, ye portals. Enter herein, ye sons of men, and behold the achievements of your race." Following him, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Taylor said a few words, and Mayor Rolla Wells spoke briefly. And then Senator Burnham spoke briefly. And then Mr. Tawney and Mr. LeGrave and Mr. Harriman spoke briefly. And towards noon, Mr. Taft was introduced to deliver the principal speech. I was unable to hear all of his remarks, but I do remember the last few lines. "I should be unjust," he said, "if I did not testify to the skill and tact and limitless energy of the men of St. Louis, with President Francis at their head, to whom we owe this blazing picture of the world's progress. No one who does not know the difficulties can pay a proper tribute to those who have erected this monument to the progress of man."
At 12:15, the speeches were over, and President Francis wired President Roosevelt in Washington that they were ready. At 1:06 p.m., Roosevelt opened the fair.
difficult now to express the wonder and the sense of awe which we experienced when we first saw the fair on opening day. Strangers smiled at strangers. We admired everything, the statues, the buildings, the fountains, the good and the bad. We liked it all.
In 1904, at the time of the World's Fair, motion picture film and motion picture projectors, as we know them, did not exist. Instead, what were called movies were taken on an old-fashioned hand-crank camera, and then were displayed in a peep show device like this, a bioscope or a mutoscope. Each separate image, instead of being recorded on film, was recorded on a card, and then the cards were arranged in series like so that then when you put the cards arranged like this into the bioscope or mutoscope and turned the hand crank, you got the effect of motion pictures. It worked like this. Well, then in 1952, a man by the name of Kemp Niver, who curiously enough was a private detective in Hollywood, became fascinated by this problem. He worked on it for a matter of about 5 years, and in 1957 he finally succeeded. That is, he succeeded in transferring these early-day moving pictures from paper rolls to a modern film base. Well, it's been our great good fortune to find out that among the thousands of feet of this early-day film were some pictures of our own St. Louis World Fair. They're not perfect. There are many important scenes of the fair that they omit. But they do have the effect of showing St. Louis as it was 50 years ago, when men and women now in their 60s were 50 years younger and were, in fact, children clutching their parents' hands. They show the fair as it was in 1904. They've never been projected before. In fact, until recently, no one in St. Louis even knew they existed. But here they are, and they begin, as you might expect, with a grand panorama of the Grand Basin.
I was working for the Multiscope and Biograph Company, and I had hired a boat to try to make a shot under the DeSoto Bridge. I had tied the camera down to the floor of the boat so it wouldn't move, and as I went under, I framed to the left so I could get a statue they called a cowboy at rest. This was very popular. There was a lot of controversy about whether a cowboy should lie down or should he be squatting. I panned across the Joliet Bridge and then picked up the front of the Palace of Education. I remember I had purposely waited until there was a good breeze so I could catch the flags when they were moving. Seems odd now, but in 1904, everybody admired this building because it had simplicity. I shot the East Pavilion, which, incidentally, had a wonderful restaurant in it. Then started to pan across the colonnade of the stage. I had to cut off some of the festival hall, but I was told that the dome of that building was larger than St. Peter's in Rome. So I guess I had some excuse. By this time, I could feel the film running out, so I decided to end the shot on the West Pavilion. That afternoon, I got permission to get up on the roof of the German building, and I made a shot looking north down the Plaza Orleans. The only trouble with it was that I had to pan the education building again. That palace was 210,000 feet square, and it was about the smallest. The largest was the agriculture building. That took in a 10-city block area under one roof. When I got to the basin, I checked the fountains, and this time they were working all right. Then I had some luck when a boat came by, and I wound up with what I thought was a pretty fair shot. The next day, there was a pageant on the Big Lagoon. President Francis was in the first boat, along with a floral cornucopia and a statue of Jefferson. Following him, there were 30 launches, 20 gondolas, 2 barges, a couple of rowboats, and a dugout canoe. The St. Louis boat had a floral picture of a keg of beer and a pair of shoes. The promoter of the Boer War pageant sent over a load of soldiers playing bagpipes about 3 sheets to the wind. The French commissioner hired the Swan boat, which was one of the 3 that included the Sea Serpent and Cleopatra's barge. One of the amazing things about the fair was that they had parades like this every other week, and there were always special days. Now this is the Italian boat, and that gondolier was brought over from Venice. At night, he used to sing, and I understand that if he lost his voice, he lost his job. In the Russian boat, one of them was dressed up in a bearskin for the occasion. The last boat I shot was from the Tyrolean Alps restaurant. It seemed like all they ever did was yodel and wave. I would guess that from the day it opened, the fair was never without a parade of some kind or another. And of course, they made very good subjects for us. This one was the parade of the pikers, which were all those foreign people in the amusement section. I couldn't get a good camera position, but I did get a fair shot of the ones from an exhibit called Mysterious Asia. Some Turkish swordsmen followed the camels, but they were blocked by the crowd. After the Asians passed, the Tyrolean Alps people came by. They were still yodeling and waving. They gave out prizes that day for the best floats. Jim Key, the educated horse, got one for the best floral display. And the Eskimos won a prize for the most novel decoration. This was the 20 Mule team from Death Valley. The driver was called Boric Bill, and the newspapers referred to him as a picturesque character, which in plainer English meant that he drank too much and swore at the mules.
Of all the possible subjects at the fair, the one that fascinated this forgotten cameraman was a military parade. And on almost any day, you stood a good chance of being run over by one. Everybody liked to see the soldiers march, and they came to the fair by the thousands. There were the Jefferson Guards, the Royal Saxons, the Philippine Scouts, and the Lancashire Fusiliers. The Royal Italian Marines, the Black Horse Cavalry, the Mounted Police, the 119th Coast Artillery, and the Edisto Rifles. The Banco Rosa, the Indian Band, Kilty's Band, the Spalding Greys, the Grenadier Guards, the 1st Kentucky, the 1st Missouri, and the Mexican Artillery Band. The Essex Fusiliers, the West Point Cadets, the Culver Cadets, the Mississippi Agricultural and Mechanical College Cadets, the GAR, the Spanish War Veterans, the Knights of Pythias, Uniform Rank, and the United States Marines.
I joined my corps when 21. Of course, I thought it capital fun. When the enemy came, then off I run. I wasn't cut out for the army. When I left home, Mama, she cried. Mama, she cried. Mama, she cried. When I left home, Mama, she cried. He ain't cut out for the army. And Captain Jinks is a horse Marines. I give my horse to corn and beans. Of course, it's quite beyond my means. So I'm captain in the army.
We will see more of these photographic memories of the fair in just a moment. But equally as important as the recollections we can see are the memories of many St. Louisans for whom the fair is still a personal experience. Among these is Miss Dina Lang, who has been a teacher in public schools in St. Louis for over 50 years and who has written a history of St. Louis. Well, Miss Lang, if I may ask, how old were you at the time of the fair?
Well, I was in my first year at high school, and that made me about 15.
What area were you living in?
We had just moved over on the north side. There was a new section of St. Louis near Sarah and Maffett that had just opened up, and in May of 1904, we moved into the new home.
Well, did you go over to the fair much?
Very often. In fact, the whole year preceding the opening of the fair, we went 2 or 3 times a week. I had a brother who was a young architect, was very much interested out there in the buildings, and I went with him quite often.
What's your most lasting personal impression of the fair?
Well, it was the most magnificent spectacle I think I've ever seen. I've been to many other fairs, and I don't think any of them have ever come up to the World's Fair.
You mean architecturally, just in spaciousness?
Architecturally, in its glory and its magnificence. It was the first time that we had used electricity with any great, or the first time that buildings were being lighted with electricity, and we certainly used it there to a great effect.
What did you find yourself doing at the fair most of the time?
Oh, well, we roamed around. We knew every spot of the whole fair, all the way from the entranceway of the Pike to Bigorota villages and on to the agriculture buildings and horticulture. And, of course, always at night there was the gorgeous cascades and the electric lights and the Pike with its Ferris wheels and chutes and
exhibits and rides?
Exhibits of all kinds.
Well, I've heard that the fair was quite a place as far as being an area for the introduction of all kinds of new novelty foods. What were then novelty foods? We heard that the ice cream cone was first introduced at the fair. Is that right?
Yes, I'm quite sure. That was the first time, at least, that I saw ice cream cones, and we had them quite often. They sold them usually 2 for a nickel, so that they went sort of far, too. Sometimes 2 people could eat 1 ice cream cone. Then we had lovely little rosette cakes. They were made by dipping an iron into a batter and putting it into some hot fat. And, oh, those were delicious. And the barbecue sandwiches.
That was the debut of the barbecue sandwich on a
I
large
think
scale?
probably it was. And they were far better than anything I have ever eaten. And you could get a big one for 5 cents. And these stands were all over the fairgrounds, and the food was excellent. And, of course, it was if you were very wise in your selection, you could get free meals all day long. You go to the Pillsbury exhibit and get hot cross buns and coffee cake and breads.
What was your favorite exhibit?
Well, I think probably, let's see, the Festival Hall and the Igoroti Village. I think that the Philippine village with its lovely bridge across the river there and all the different tribes, I think that, I would say.
We've heard that from a good many people, but certainly in the whole fair, one of the exhibits that everyone's memory seems to retain is the Philippine exhibition in the Igorot village. Well, that was located in this area here, in the area of Clayton Road and Forsyth, in what is now an area of quite fashionable homes. Where Wydown Terrace is now, they built Arrowhead Lake, and on its shores they brought savage tribes from the Philippines to live in their customary fashion. It was a sort of anthropological zoo, where, for a small fee, the St. Louisan could see the progress of man to its highest achievement, namely himself. Armed with a comfortable sense of the white man's burden, he could watch the Moro children dive for nickels. Surrounding the Philippine reservation itself, there were camps of almost every kind of savage, from giant Patagonians to Batwa pygmies. The smallest people at the fair were the Negritos. They had wonderful skill with the bow and arrow. And shortly after the fair opened, when the grounds were infested with sparrows, the officials sent them out to abate that nuisance, which they did quite handily. For the most, St. Louis and the savages got along very well, but there was an occasional shock. For example, everyone was quite charmed by this Negrito wedding, until they discovered that the bridegroom had 2 brides. But the most controversial tribe was a head-hunting band of savages called the Igorots. For one thing, their chief insisted on a telephone in his hut as a distinction appropriate to his rank. And then there was the matter of their diet. They planted their own rice paddy, which was all right, but it seemed that their staple food at home was dog meat. After they arrived, Dr. T.K. Hunt, the man in charge, applied to the city pound for their dinner. Members of the Women's Humane Society had an emergency meeting and declared their opposition. Mr. Mortimer Jeffers of Dexter, Missouri, said the society had no control over him and he would supply 100 dogs personally. The Humane Society replied that if the Igorots wanted dog meat, they could import it in cans. Chief Antonio then wrote a letter to Mr. Taft. Taft replied that the request was reasonable and approved the voucher. And Dr. T.K. Hunt closed the deal with the pound. Courteously, Chief Antonio invited Mr. Taft to their feast, but Taft said he had other commitments and declined. By this time, the Igorots were the hit of the fair. And throughout the summer, no matter what time of day you visited their camp, and no matter what they were doing at the time, you could count on the fact that behind every tree there would be a St. Louisan. A few blocks from the Igorots, on the other side of the huge agricultural building, there was another entertainment equally unique. It was a pageant of the Boer War, held in this arena, and the actors were the actual soldiers who fought the original battles, including General Cronje, who twice a day reenacted his bloody defeat at Paardeburg. The show began with a formal parade by both sides. First, the Boers, many of whom still had the scars from the original battle. Then the British troops, the Highland Brigade and the New South Wales Lancers, led by Major Stewart and Captain Franklin. After a salute, the mock war began. Once again, General Cronje lost the Battle of Paardeburg. And once again, the general and his men surrendered to Lord Roberts. But though the general was not lucky in war, the story did have a happy ending. While in St. Louis, General Cronje was also conquered by love. And on the 5th of July, in a simple ceremony at the arena, he married Mrs. Johanna Sterzel of Pretoria. The bride wore a simple gray dress with a small bouquet of sweet peas. They were both very happy. When President McKinley announced his support of the fair, he said, among other things, that expositions are the timekeepers of progress. Well, if the Louisiana Purchase Exposition had any central unifying purpose, it was certainly that, to show the world what mankind was doing. To this end, the directors assembled more people and inventions and things and products than had ever been assembled before. Virtually every nation in the world and every state in the Union was represented displaying its wares. There was so much here that Mr. Francis once remarked that if all the rest of mankind were blotted out, there would be enough here in the exhibits at the St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition to reestablish the standards of civilization. Well, true or false? Certainly in 1904, it appeared that mankind was riding high, wide, and handsome. Certainly, there was no better symbol of this than the great Ferris wheel. It was built at a cost of more than $360,000. In diameter, it was 250 feet and could, if need be, carry 2,160 people on a single whirl. Each car held 60 people. And on one occasion, a cowboy named John Craven married his sweetheart, Dolly Kaufman of Cloud City, Kansas, in one of the cars. Both were on horseback. While the wheel turned through the summer months, every means that man had yet devised to put himself in motion appeared on the fairground.
I had come to the fair with my wife especially to see the inventions. Especially, I wanted to see the wireless telegraph tower. There were some men who sent messages all the way to Chicago, and you could hear them yourself. Then there was a Portuguese priest with a sun machine. This machine could produce a heat of over 7,000 degrees. Then we went to the agricultural building where was the floral clock. Inside that building was the statue of President Roosevelt made out of Buddha. And there was also a bear made from prunes. And that was very interesting. Then I saw that each state had made out of corn and grain some pictures of the farms and even some small buildings. In the Palace of Transportation, there were 4 miles of railroad track and many streetcars and locomotives. Once I was working for the Lüdinghaus Captainship Wagon Company of St. Louis. So natürlich, I was especially interested in wagons. I like best the police wagons and some very fine dead wagons. I remember there was also with the dead wagons an advertisement which gave good advice. I wanted very much to learn about the automobiles because I had at that time a little shop for bicycle repair, and I thought that automobiles might be a good sideline for the bicycles. At the Palace of Varied Industries, my wife wanted especially to visit where was all the women's clothes from Paris. My wife said that one dress cost $4,000, and I told her that was not possible. But a few weeks later, the water leaked in one of those presses, and the French government said there was $1 million of damage. So, after we saw the dresses, we just walked around to see what was. At noon we had to leave, but I will never forget the fair, especially the bear that was made from prunes.
There were at the fair a great many things which the people of the time swore would never be forgotten or surpassed. But they have been. And strangely enough, to many people, the most memorable part of the fair was a part that never pretended to be much more than a passing fancy. And that was the pike. The pike was a light-hearted mile of amusements that ran from the Ballivier on the east to Skinker on the west. And of all the 20 million people who walked its length that summer, it's a fair guess that no one of them ever forgot it.
Come in from Moberly that morning, and I don't guess I'll ever forget the first time I walked down the pike. There was a place called Mysterious Asia that had about the wildest bunch of people on the market. There was 300 Mohammedans and 22 fellows that called themselves devil worshippers. And it appeared to me like they didn't get along at all. There was supposed to be a parade that morning, and the fellow that owned the place was trying to get them lined up. But they was too busy arguing with each other to pay him any mind. Some devil worshiper had stolen a golden peacock away from the Mohammedans. And before it was over, they just about beat the namesake out of him trying to get it back. Further on, I saw the first elephant I had ever seen. And I remember wondering where in the world you could ever get a saddle for something like that. Now, on the streets of Cairo, you could take a camel ride if you wanted to, and that was 15 cents. Or if you didn't have that kind of money, donkey ride was just a dime. By the time I got to the snake charmers, I was looking pretty close. And it looked to me like some of those people weren't all they were supposed to be. In the Cairo place, there were some fellows with swords, but I was looking in the other direction. According to the papers, the Board of Lady Managers hired a detective to spy out the dancers to make sure that none of them wiggled too much. But from my personal observation, I would say they hired the wrong man.
Every day that we could, my brother and I would pack a lunch in the morning and walk to the fair. The pike was best of all. At one place, you could pretend you were in an airship and go all the way to Paris. And then after you saw Paris, you came back by submarine. Further down the pike, you could go to the North Pole, and that was very popular in July and August. All the exhibits had a barker out front, and they always made each one sound better than the last. I remember in Old St. Louis, I saw my first real Indian chief, and another time we saw the real Geronimo. He was pretty old by then, and we were a little disappointed. There was a castle called Battle Abbey, but I didn't like it much, and I would only go with my brother if he would go to Fair Japan. The best ride was in the Magic Whirlpool. You took a boat to an enchanted lake and then came down a waterfall. We rode the longest shoot-the-chutes in the world, but my brother liked the one at Hagenbeck Circus best. I thought it was cruel, but he said elephants liked it. My favorite was Jim Key, the educated horse. He could add, subtract, spell, and do long division, or at least I thought he could then. My brother liked the Battle of Santiago best, and we went a dozen times, even though I didn't like battles very much. It really was a wonderful show. For a long time, we couldn't figure out how they worked. But then my brother found out that there was a man sitting in each boat who could make it do whatever he wanted. Later on, by accident, one of the Spanish ships called the Reina de Mar tipped over, and the man inside almost drowned. My brother got a book from the library about Commodore Schley. He was commander of the cruiser Brooklyn and the American hero of the battle. For the rest of the summer, my brother would be the Commodore and I would be the crew. He had memorized some of the speeches, and he would go out in the backyard and shout them. One of them was, "Put your helm hard aport, Mr. Cook." And another I remember was, "Don't throw that body overboard, Simpson. We'll give it a Christian burial." It was a wonderful summer.
One of the saddest and truest cliches in our language is the one that all good things must come to an end. On December 1st, 1904, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition closed its gates for the last time. But not before the people of St. Louis paid their tribute to the man they considered to be the most responsible for the great exposition. There had been many special days at the fair that fabulous summer, from Missouri Day to Colonial Dames Day. But this was the day of days. David Roland Francis Day. Once more, and for the last time, the crowd assembled at the Louisiana Monument. Mayor Wells and Governor Dockery, along with other dignitaries, were on the platform. But most of the audience were just people of St. Louis come to say thank you to Mr. Francis. For more than 3 years, David Francis represented St. Louis to the world. He had talked with kings and presidents and entertained the charming Miss Alice Roosevelt. He had gone to more banquets and smiled at more people and done more than any one man should have to do. He had been kind to William Jennings Bryan, and he had smiled for the triplets, William, Jennings, and Bryan. He had met the great and near great, and even suffered through a song in his honor.
Every home in the east, every home in the west, the north and the south and the guest. May the voice of the people re-echo through each star, for David Roland Francis, the man of the hour. Behold him, ye friends, so noble and grand, the peer of his country, the pride of the land. Let each loyal heart in harmony check, for David Roland Francis, the man of the hour.
For 7 months, he made 6 speeches a day. For his trouble, he heard a few more speeches and received a solid silver tea service. That night, Mr. Francis made his final speech. He said, With the turn of this key, the lights of the exposition will be extinguished forever. I can only say farewell, a last farewell to all this splendor. And now for Laclede Gas Company. Farewell and good night.